Hello, my dear friends. Let's start with a picture. You are seated on a silk cushion, low to the ground, in a hall so vast it seems to swallow the light of 1,000 flickering oil lamps. The air is thick, a heavy blanket woven from sandalwood, incense, blooming flowers, and the low thrum of a distant zither. Before you, a low table of polished, dark wood holds treasures, a single jade cup filled with a warm, cloudy liquid, chopsticks of polished silver, and a lacquered bowl so fine you can see your own distorted reflection in its surface. This is a banquet at the very heart of ancient China, a feast thrown by the emperor himself. It's the pinnacle of power, wealth, and sophisticated taste. Frankly, if you were dropped into this scene with your modern palate, you probably wouldn't last the first course. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly means the world. Now, get cozy. Picture that great hall, the soft rustle of silk robes, the gentle clink of jade pendants as servants glide silently across the stone floors. Imagine the warmth of the air, the hypnotic dance of the lamp flames. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel a little overwhelmed, and who could blame you? Everything around you is a performance of effortless perfection. The pillars holding up the cavernous roof are wrapped in embroidered silks. The musicians in the corner play a melody so subtle it feels more like a change in air pressure than a sound. Even the other guests, all high-ranking officials and nobles, move with a serene, practiced grace. They murmur to each other behind painted fans, their faces calm and unreadable. This is the great illusion of imperial power, a world without sweat, without effort, without flaw. It's a carefully constructed fantasy, designed to convince everyone, including those who live within it, that the emperor is more than a man. He is a force of nature, and his court is a reflection of divine, cosmic order. Then, the food begins to arrive. And here, the illusion reaches its breathtaking peak. Dish after dish is placed before you, not by a single servant, but by a silent, synchronized procession. These aren't just meals, they are miniature landscapes, edible sculptures. A whole fish seems to leap from a bed of glistening black beans, its scales shimmering. A mound of vibrant greens is arranged into the shape of a miniature mountain, with a trickle of sauce for a waterfall. There are delicate dumplings shaped like lotus buds, and thinly sliced meats fanned out like the tail of a peacock. It's all so beautiful, so artistic, you feel a pang of guilt at the thought of disturbing it. You watch a high-ranking minister beside you. He lifts his silver chopsticks, plucks a piece of the peacock tail meat, and dips it into a small bowl of dark, glossy sauce. He eats it with a look of deep, contemplative satisfaction. So you follow his lead. You choose a piece of what looks like tender, roasted duck. The skin is a perfect, inviting amber. You lift it to your lips, anticipating the rich, savory flavor you know and love. But the moment it touches your tongue, your senses recoil in confusion. The first sensation isn't richness, it's salt. An aggressive, eye-watering wave of salt that seems to suck all the moisture from your mouth. Beneath the salt is a powerful, vinegary sourness, and under that something else. A deep, funky, almost musky flavor. It's pungent and overwhelming. The texture is wrong. 2. The meat isn't tender and yielding. It's dense, dry, and chewy. You manage to swallow, your throat burning slightly. You take a sip of the warm liquid in your jade cup, hoping to cleanse your palate. It's a cloudy, slightly sweet, slightly sour beverage that does little to help. Hesitantly, you try the beautiful mountain of greens. They look so crisp and fresh. But they aren't. They are limp, slippery, and saturated with that same intense combination of salt and sour brine. They are pickles. Delicious pickles, perhaps by the standards of the day, but a far cry from the tender crisp steamed vegetables you envisioned. Every dish presents the same shocking contrast. The magnificent leaping fish is soft and almost mushy, its flesh completely permeated by a coarse, salty paste. The delicate lotus dumplings are filled with a strange, savory mash that has a sharp, fermented tang. The glamour of the presentation is a lie. Or rather, it's a beautiful mask for a very different reality. You are not eating fresh food. You are eating, almost exclusively, preserved food. And this is the great, forgotten secret of not just this banquet, but almost all of ancient cuisine. We see the paintings, read the poems about magnificent feasts, and imagine a world of farm-to-table freshness. The truth is that getting anything truly fresh to a massive, inland capital city was a logistical impossibility. There were no refrigerated barges, no ice-packed carts, no flash freezing. There was only salt. There was the sun for drying. There was smoke from fires. And there was the transformative, mysterious power of fermentation. The overwhelming flavors you're tasting aren't just for enjoyment. They are the very tools of survival. That intense saltiness in the duck wasn't a clumsy mistake by the chef. It was the preservative that allowed the bird to travel for weeks from a southern province without rotting. The sourness of the vegetables is the result of the pickling that kept them edible months after they were harvested. This wasn't a sign of failure. It was a testament to the emperor's incredible power. His reach was so vast, he could summon foods from every corner of the empire, and his wealth so great, he could afford the immense amounts of salt and spices needed to preserve them. The chefs in the imperial kitchen were not just cooks, they were masters of preservation. Their genius lay in their ability to take these harsh, aggressively preserved ingredients and, through complex techniques and balancing flavors, turn them into something palatable, even desirable. The beautiful arrangements were a way of restoring the illusion of life to ingredients that had been, in a sense, mummified. They were honoring the memory of freshness. As you look down your table, past the sculptural arrangements and the glittering vessels, your eyes keep being drawn to that little bowl of dark, glossy sauce. It was served with almost every dish. Its scent is a complex mix of salty, savory, and something that reminds you of damp earth after a rain. It seems to be the key, the one flavor that ties this entire strange culinary world together. It is the lifeblood of this ancient cuisine, a powerful, pungent paste that is both a seasoning and a preservative. And as you watch the nobles around you dip their food into it with such reverence, you realize you're looking at the ancestor of all sauces, the origin of a flavor that would one day conquer the world, born from the absolute necessity of perpetual pickling. That little bowl of dark, glossy sauce continues to hold your attention. It seems to be the one constant on this bewildering culinary landscape. Its aroma is the bass note in the symphony of the feast, deep, earthy, and intensely savory. You watch as the nobles around you, people who command armies and govern provinces, treat this simple-looking condiment with a quiet deference. They don't slather it on, but use it with precision, a delicate touch of their silver chopsticks to anoint a piece of dried meat or a pickled vegetable. For them, this isn't just a sauce. It's the soul of the dish. This is jing, and in the ancient world, a household status and a kitchen's reputation could be measured by the quality of its jing pot. To have a rich, aged, perfectly balanced jing was a mark of supreme sophistication. It was the liquid equivalent of owning a priceless work of art, a secret passed down through generations. The illusion is that this is a sauce born of pure culinary genius, a complex reduction simmered for hours by a master chef from dozens of rare and esoteric ingredients. You imagine a calm, clean kitchen where a chef in spotless silks carefully tends to a simmering pot, tasting and adjusting until it reaches this state of dark, glossy perfection. You see it as the final, artistic touch. But if you were to follow the origins of this sauce, you wouldn't be led to a pristine imperial kitchen. You would be led to the back courtyard, to a row of large, unglazed earthenware jars baking in the hot sun, covered with heavy lids. And if you were to lift one of those lids, you would be hit with a smell so pungent, so biologically active, that it would make the strong flavors on the banquet table seem subtle by comparison. This is where the shocking reality of jing begins. The soul of ancient cuisine is, for lack of a better word, a product of controlled rot. To make it, the cooks would begin not with rare spices, but with the humblest of ingredients, soybeans or sometimes wheat, barley or even fish guts for a different variety. Let's imagine the soybean version. The beans are soaked and then boiled for hours until they are a thick, bland, grey-brown mush. This unappetizing slurry is then poured into molds and pressed into firm cakes or bricks. And here is where a modern health inspector would simply shut the entire operation down. These bricks of bean mush are then taken to a special room. It's a warm, humid space, often with straw laid on the floor, and they are just left there for weeks. You peer into this dark, damp room. The air is thick with the smell of mildew and earth. The bricks are arranged on straw mats, and you can see a fine, pale fuzz beginning to colonize their surfaces. Day by day, this fuzz grows thicker, changing color. It becomes a tapestry of green, yellow, and black mold. It looks exactly like something you would find at the back of your refrigerator and immediately throw into the bin, probably sealing it in 3 plastic bags first. But to the ancient cook, This is not spoilage. This is magic. They are deliberately cultivating a living organism, a specific kind of beneficial mold, a cousin to the one used to make safe and missa that has settled on the bean cakes from the very air and straw of the room. This furry, multicolored brick of what looks like decay is the secret ingredient. Once the bricks are sufficiently fuzzy, they are taken out into the sunlight to dry, killing the surface mold but leaving the powerful enzymes it created inside. The dried, moldy cakes are then smashed into pieces and thrown into those large earthenware jars you saw in the courtyard. They are mixed with an enormous amount of salt and water, creating a thick, chunky, incredibly saline brine. The heavy lid is placed on top, and the jar is left to the mercy of the elements for months, sometimes for years. The cook's only job is to come out periodically, lift the lid, and stir the fermenting sludge with a long wooden paddle, releasing bubbles of gas that smell funky and sour. The sun warms the jar, accelerating the fermentation, while the massive quantity of salt prevents harmful bacteria from taking over. Inside that jar, the enzymes from the mold are working tirelessly, breaking down the complex proteins and starches in the soybeans into a cascade of simpler compounds, amino acids, which create that deep savory taste of umami, and sugars, which add a subtle sweetness and complexity. This explains everything. The reason Jing was so valuable was because it was a process, not just a recipe. It took an incredible amount of time, patience, and risk. A batch could spoil, attract the wrong kind of bacteria, or simply not develop the right flavor. But when it worked, it was a miracle. It was a way of creating intense, delicious, and most importantly, stable flavor from almost nothing. In a world with no bouillon cubes, no yeast extract, no this controlled fermentation was the only way to generate the profound savory depth that makes food so satisfying. It was a flavor bomb that could be deployed to rescue the blandest grain porridge or to mask the slightly off taste of preserved fish. It was the ultimate culinary tool, born not from a desire for luxury, but from the brutal necessity of making a limited and challenging diet not just edible, but genuinely enjoyable. Looking back at the refined noble at the banquet table, you see him in a new light. His appreciation for the Jing isn't just snobbery, it's a deep-seated cultural understanding of the time, labor, and managed decay that went into producing that single, perfect drop of flavor. The sauce connects the elegance of the imperial table directly to the moldy bricks and the sun-baked fermentation pots in the yard. It was a bridge between the beautiful illusion of freshness and the much harsher reality of how one survived. And this reliance on preservation wasn't limited to sauces. It dictated what you could find in your bowl for every course of the meal, especially when it came to the most prized ingredient of all, meat. You turn your attention back to the dishes laid out on your lacquered table. The initial shock of the aggressive saltiness and sourness is beginning to fade, replaced by a growing curiosity. You look again at the artfully arranged slices of meat, the ones that looked like a peacock's tail, and you look at the whole steamed fish, its mouth agape as if in a silent cry. The poems and historical accounts you've read painted pictures of imperial hunts, of messengers on swift horses rushing live carp from a distant lake directly to the palace kitchens. The glamorous illusion is one of ultimate freshness, a testament to the emperor's power to bend time and distance to his will, to command nature itself. A fresh kill from the morning hunt, a fish still flapping as it meets the cleaver. This is what you were led to expect. But as you now know, that's not what you're eating. The reality is far more complex and, frankly, a lot less appetizing. Let's follow the journey of that fresh fish. It was indeed pulled from a famous lake, a place renowned for its sweet, clean water and plump carp. But that lake is hundreds of miles away. The emperor's decree for fresh fish sets in motion a frantic, desperate relay race against the clock of decay. The fish is pulled from the water and placed into a wooden tub on a cart, or perhaps a tank on a river barge. For the first day, maybe two, it remains alive, listlessly swimming in its own filth. But the journey is long. The water grows warm and stagnant. The fish dies. And the moment it dies, the race becomes even more desperate. There is no ice. There is no refrigeration. There is only ingenuity born of necessity. The fish is immediately gutted, but that only buys a little time. The most common technique is to pack it, inside and out, with a mountain of coarse salt. Or, it might be submerged entirely in a vat of that Jing we just explored, the intense sauce acting as both a preservative and a marinade. Another option is to smear it with the leftover dregs from making grain alcohol, the lees acting as a mild preservative. For a journey of many weeks, it might be heavily salted and then dried in the sun until it's as stiff as a board, or hung over a smoky fire until it's dark and leathery. By the time it arrives at the palace kitchen, it is no longer a fresh fish. It is a salted fish, a pickled fish, a dried fish, or a smoked fish. It is a piece of protein that has been violently shielded from putrefaction. The glamour of the imperial kitchen is the cook's ability to reverse this process, to resurrect the fish. The stiff, salt-cured slab is soaked for hours, even days, in changes of fresh water to draw out the brutal excess of salt. The leathery, smoked carcass is steamed for an eternity to try and restore some semblance of moisture to its flesh. The fish that was preserved in Jing is carefully rinsed, its flesh now permanently stained and infused with that deep, funky flavor. The why behind this whole charade is rooted in the very concept of imperial power. The emperor had to be seen as semi-divine, a master of the world. To admit that he couldn't have fresh fish from a specific lake simply because it was too far away would be an admission of weakness, a crack in the myth. It was better to perform this elaborate, resource-intensive pantomime of freshness than to concede to the simple, logistical truth. The performance was the point. The immense cost of the salt, the manpower for the relay, the skilled chefs who could make the preserved product look and taste remotely like the original, it was all a spectacular display of wealth and control. The nobles eating it understood this perfectly. They weren't being fooled into thinking it was truly fresh. They were admiring the sheer power required to bring it to their table at all. Eating the salty, firm flesh, they were tasting the reach of the empire. This same logic applied to almost every meat. The ducks, the geese, the chickens, they couldn't be raised in the crowded, sprawling capital. They were herded or carted in from the countryside. Many would be slaughtered and immediately preserved to prevent loss. A favorite method was wind drying. A bird would be gutted, rubbed with salt and spices, and then hung from the eaves of a building for weeks, exposed to the dry, winter winds until it became dense, hard, and intensely flavored. This is the ancestor of modern cured meats like prosciutto, but it was born from a world without any other options. What you're tasting in that beautiful fan of roasted duck isn't the juicy, fatty bird you'd get today. It's larue, a type of cured meat, which has been steamed to soften it and then perhaps flash-fried to give the skin a touch of crispness. But its fundamental nature is that of preservation. Its texture is chewy, its flavor is salty, and it has a slight gamey tang that comes from the aging process, even for the common person. This was the reality. Fresh meat was a rare luxury, something you ate on a festival day, or if you were lucky enough to live next to a farmer. For most, meat came in the form of these heavily preserved products, which were used sparingly, as a flavoring agent to make a large pot of grains or vegetables more exciting. A small piece of salted pork could be boiled in a soup for hours, its salt and flavor leaching out to enrich the entire broth. The idea of eating a large, prime cut of fresh meat as the centerpiece of a meal was simply not part of the culinary vocabulary for anyone but the absolute, top-tier elite on the rarest of occasions. This constant battle against decay, this reliance on harsh preservatives, didn't just affect the taste and texture of the food. It had a profound impact on how they thought about food, and how it related to the most important science of the day, medicine. The flavors on your plate weren't just there for pleasure, they were prescriptions for your very health. As you sit there, still acclimatizing to the powerful flavors, you notice something else. It's a subtle undercurrent beneath the waves of salt and sourness. In one dish, a stewed vegetable preparation, there's a distinct and lingering bitterness. It's not the pleasant bitterness of dark chocolate or coffee, but a more medicinal, herbal bitterness that coats the back of your tongue. In another dish, a soup with floating morsels of what looks like pork fat, you detect a strange, pungent heat, not from a chili pepper. Those are still centuries away from arriving in China, but something more acrid and sharp, like Jinger's aggressive cousin. You've been focused on the flavors of preservation, but now you're tasting the flavors of prescription. The glamorous illusion of ancient Chinese cuisine, especially at the imperial level, is that it was a purely hedonistic art form. The poems sing of chefs competing to create the most exquisitely delicious and decadent dishes to please the emperor's palate. You imagine the goal was simple: make it taste good. But the reality was that the imperial chef had two masters, and they were often at odds. He had to please the emperor's tongue, but he also had to satisfy the imperial physician. Every single meal served in the palace was scrutinized through the lens of traditional Chinese medicine. The kitchen was not just a kitchen, it was a pharmacy. And the chef was not just a cook, he was a dispenser of preventative medicine. This brings us to the shocking reality that many of the flavors you're tasting are not there for your enjoyment at all. They are there to create balance. The foundational belief of the time was that the human body was a microcosm of the universe, governed by the same forces, yin and yang, and the five elements or phases would: fire, earth, metal, and water. Each of these phases was associated with a season, a bodily organ, a color, and, most importantly for our story, a flavor. Wood was sour, fire was bitter, earth was sweet, metal was pungent or acrid, and water was salty. A healthy body was one where these forces were in perfect equilibrium. Illness was a sign of imbalance, too much fire, not enough water, and so on. The why is that food was seen as the primary tool for maintaining this balance. Every ingredient, from a humble stalk of celery to a prized piece of venison, was categorized by its inherent nature: hot, warm, neutral, cool, or cold, and its flavor. A food's nature wasn't about its physical temperature, but its perceived effect on the body. For example, lamb was considered hot, while crab was cold. The job of the cook, guided by the physician, was to assemble a meal that would counteract any imbalances in the emperor's body or that would align his internal state with the current season. So if it was a damp, cold winter day, the menu would be filled with hot and warm foods like lamb, ginger, and pungent spices to drive out the cold and dampness. If it was a hot, dry summer, the dishes would feature cool and cold ingredients like watermelon, mung beans, or certain types of fish to cool the body down. This is where the unpalatable flavors come in. Let's say the imperial physician diagnosed the emperor with an excess of heart fire, perhaps manifesting as anxiety or mouth sores. The heart is associated with the element of fire, and the flavor of fire is bitter. Therefore, the chef would be commanded to introduce bitter-flavored ingredients into the meal to quell that fire. He might be forced to add bitter herbs, certain uncooked greens, or even ground-up bitter apricot kernels to a dish. The goal wasn't to make the dish taste deliciously bitter. The goal was to deliver a dose of bitterness as medicine. The flavor was a vehicle for the therapy. This explains the acrid heat in your pork soup. Pork fat was considered rich and dampening, potentially causing sluggishness. To counteract this, the chef would have been required to add a large quantity of a pungent ingredient like galangal or Sichuan peppercorns, which create a numbing sensation, not just heat, to disperse the dampness and aid digestion. You aren't tasting a chef's bold flavor pairing, you're tasting a doctor's prescription. This philosophy extended to every aspect of the meal. The sourness you're tasting everywhere doesn't just come from pickling. Sour was the flavor of the wood element, associated with the liver and believed to have an astringent quality. A little sourness was thought to aid digestion. Salt, the flavor of the water element and the kidneys, was believed to direct therapeutic effects downward in the body. Imagine the poor imperial chef. He's trying to create a masterpiece, but is essentially being told by a doctor, "That's a lovely painting, but you need to add a splash of this ugly brown paint right in the middle for the sake of the emperor's spleen." The artistry of the chef was in his ability to integrate these often discordant medicinal flavors in a way that was, if not delicious, at least not actively disgusting. He might try to balance the required bitterness with a touch of honey or maltose, or mask a pungent herb within the complexity of a fermented jing sauce. When you taste a dish that seems perfectly balanced and harmonious, you are tasting a moment when the demands of pleasure and the demands of medicine happen to align. But when you taste that jarring, out-of-place bitterness, you are tasting a moment when medicine won the argument. This philosophy trickled down to all levels of society, though in a much simpler form. A common family might not have a physician diagnosing their spleen deficiency, but folk wisdom would guide them. Eat ginger in the morning to warm you for the day. Drink chrysanthemum tea in the summer to cool you down. This thinking fundamentally shaped the flavor profile of the cuisine, creating a palate that was far more bitter and pungent than our modern one, which is overwhelmingly dominated by the simple trilogy of salty, sweet, and fatty. For the vast majority of people, however, these concerns about balancing the 5 flavors were a luxury. Their primary concern was much simpler: filling the pot with whatever they could find. You find your gaze drifting from the opulence of the imperial table towards an imaginary window, one that looks out from this gilded palace and into the smoky, crowded streets of the capital. The banquet is a world of overwhelming, complex flavors, of salt and fermentation and medicinal bitterness. It's a performance of abundance. But for the 99% of the population that lives outside these perfumed walls, the culinary world is defined not by flavor, but by volume. The primary goal of their daily meal is not pleasure or balance, but satiety. The glamorous illusion, often perpetuated by pastoral poems written by wealthy gentlemen who never missed a meal, is of a simple but wholesome peasant life. You picture a cheerful farmer and his family gathered around a rustic table, enjoying bowls of steaming rice, fresh vegetables from their garden, and perhaps a piece of savory pork. It's a romantic, comforting image of humble sufficiency. The shocking reality, however, is that for most of history, for most of the people, the daily meal was a thin, grey, Monotonous gruel, the central feature of the commoner's kitchen, was the all-consuming congee pot. Congee, or shu in Mandarin, is a rice porridge, but to compare the ancient reality to the delicate, flavorful congee you might find in a modern restaurant is like comparing a puddle to the ocean. The ancient congee pot was a cauldron of survival. Its main purpose was to stretch a small amount of grain into the largest possible volume of food to fill the maximum number of bellies. A single cup of grain, which would be a meager meal for one person if simply steamed, could be boiled with 10, 15, even 20 times its volume of water to create a massive pot of porridge that could feed a whole family. But what grain went into that pot? You recall the earlier section on a time before the reign of rice, while the south of China was starting to cultivate it. For much of the country, especially the north where the ancient capitals were, rice was a luxury good. The grain in that pot was millet. And not the fluffy, polished millet you might buy in a health food store today. This was coarse, tough, barely processed millet, full of grit that would get stuck in your teeth. It cooked down into a porridge that was yellowish-grey, with a slightly bitter, earthy taste and a lumpy, unappealing texture, day in, day out. This was the foundation of life. Now we must ask the most important question. What else went into the congee pot? The answer is anything. Absolutely anything that could not be eaten otherwise. This is the why of the commoner's diet. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could be wasted. The pot was a tool of radical, unsentimental resourcefulness. Those tough, fibrous outer leaves of a cabbage that a palace chef would discard, they were chopped fine and thrown into the pot, boiling for hours until they were a slimy, flavorless mass. The woody stems of herbs, the peelings from a turnip, the tops of carrots into the pot they went. Did you have a few beans that were old and hard as rocks? Boil them for 6 hours in the congee and they might become marginally chewable. The protein sources were even more grim. A small piece of that heavily salted, wind-dried meat we talked about earlier might be dangled in the pot on a string, its flavor leaching out into the gruel. It would be used day after day until it was little more than a flavorless piece of fiber, and then it might be chewed on for good measure. Bones from a chicken or pig, if you were ever so lucky to have them, would be boiled for days until they began to soften and release their marrow. Then they would be smashed to bits and boiled further, the tiny, gritty bone fragments adding a meager dose of calcium to the meal. And it gets more desperate. Insects. In times of famine, which were frequent, things like grasshoppers, cicadas and various grubs were a vital source of protein. They would be dried, pounded into a powder, and stirred into the congee to add a bit of nutty, savory flavor and much-needed nutrition. Wild plants and weeds that were bitter or even mildly toxic in their raw state could be rendered edible by boiling them for hours in the great pot. The water being changed multiple times, the congee pot was a great neutralizer, a way of diluting toxins and breaking down indible fibers. It was less a recipe and more a system of garbage disposal that happened to produce food. The flavor of this perpetual stew would have been a far cry from the aggressive tastes of the imperial banquet. It would have been predominantly bland, with a gritty texture and a murky, greyish color. Any flavors that were present would have been subtle and often accidental. A faint, lingering bitterness from wild herbs, a whisper of salt from a thrice-used piece of cured meat, an earthy taste from unwashed root vegetables. There was no jing here, no complex sauces. The only condiment might be a sprinkle of precious, coarse salt, if the family could afford it. You can almost feel the texture of it in your mouth, the soft, mushy grain interspersed with the unpleasant grittiness of sand and millet husks, the slimy texture of overboiled greens, and the occasional, unidentifiable chewy bit. This was the taste of survival. It's a world away from the banquet, yet the two are connected. The surplus that allowed for the existence of the imperial feast, the vast stores of grain, the tribute of preserved meats and fine sauces was extracted from the very people whose daily reality was this pot of gruel. The glamour of the one was built directly upon the grim necessity of the other. And yet, even within the gilded cage of the palace, the elite's desire to display their status led them to eat things that were, in their own way, just as strange as powdered insects in porridge. Let's return to the imperial banquet. You've now tasted the harshness of preservation, the bitterness of medicine, and you've imagined the bland gruel of the common folk. Surely, you think there must be some dishes here that are just about pure, hedonistic pleasure. You look for the most impressive dish on the table, the one clearly designed to be the centerpiece. It's a platter piled high with glistening, braised meats, surrounded by intricately carved vegetables. A servant leans in and murmurs its name, something poetic like the dragon's embrace of the phoenix's wing. This must be it, you think. the ancient equivalent of a perfectly cooked wagyu steak or a fine filet mignon. This is the dish meant to signify ultimate luxury, the food of the gods. The glamorous illusion is right there in the name. It conjures images of mythical, powerful beasts, suggesting that the emperor dines on things beyond the reach of mortals. It's a symbol of his dominion, not just over the earth, but over the entire cosmos. You expect the meat to be unimaginably tender, rich, and delicious. You envision the chefs selecting the most prized cuts from the finest animals, preparing them with secret techniques to unlock unparalleled flavors. This is culinary one-upmanship, the ancient version of a celebrity chef showing off. You reach out with your chopsticks and select a piece of the dark, glossy meat, but as you bring it closer, you hesitate. The texture looks unfamiliar. It's not quite the muscle tissue you're used to. It's slightly translucent, with a gelatinous sheen. And the shape is odd. Is that a paw? You pop it in your mouth, and the experience is, to put it mildly, bizarre. The flavor of the braising liquid is rich and savory, a complex blend of jing, wine, and spices. But the meat itself has very little flavor. Its defining characteristic is its texture. It's soft, gelatinous, and cartilaginous all at once. You have to chew, and chew, and chew. It's a festival of connective tissue. This isn't a tenderloin. It's a bare paw. And next to it on the platter, that might be the hump of a camel, the trunk of an elephant, or the tongue of a deer. Here we have the shocking reality of ancient status foods. For the super elite, luxury wasn't defined by taste or tenderness in the way we understand it today. It was defined by rarity, exoticism, and the sheer audacity of procuring and preparing the ingredient. The why is pure, unadulterated social signaling. Eating a bare paw wasn't about enjoying a delicious meal. It was about telling everyone at the table, I am so powerful and wealthy that I can command my hunters to go into the dangerous, remote wilderness, track and kill a bear, transport its paws all the way back to the capital before they rot, and have my chefs spend days slow cooking this tough piece of cartilage until it is edible. It was a conspicuous consumption of effort and resources. The more difficult an animal was to hunt, the more prestigious it was to eat. The stranger or more uneatable a part of the animal was, the more sophisticated you appeared for appreciating it. Camel hump, for instance, was considered a supreme delicacy. It's not muscle, but a large mound of fat and fibrous tissue. To make it palatable, it had to be boiled and steamed for days on end, and even then, its primary quality was its rich, fatty, and slightly stringy texture, not its flavor. Elephant trunk was another one, prized for the crunchy texture of its cartilage. This wasn't about finding the tastiest food. It was about finding the most impressive food. The logic is completely divorced from flavor. Think about some of the other prized delicacies from various dynasties. There were monkeys' lips, leopards' wombs, and the brains of various animals, often served with a flair for the dramatic. The more a dish could shock and awe, the better. It was the ultimate power move. It said, I do not eat the same food as lesser mortals. I dine on the rare, the difficult, and the strange. This created a culinary culture among the elite that was obsessed with sourcing the most obscure ingredients from the farthest corners of the empire. The governor of a southern province might send a tribute of preserved snakes, while a general from the western frontiers might send a gift of salted wildenesses. These ingredients were often not inherently delicious. They were tough, gamey, or texturally challenging. The genius of the imperial chefs was not in grilling a perfect steak, but in taking something as unpromising as a camel's hump or a bear's, through sheer culinary alchemy, rendering it not only edible but symbolically luxurious. This involved marathon braising sessions, intense marinades, and the liberal use of those powerful flavor agents like jing and fermented bean curd to mask any off-tastes and imbue the dish with a savory richness. The poetry on the menu was a form of misdirection. Dragon's embrace sounds a lot better than slow-cooked barefoot. Phoenix's wing is more appetizing than simmered ostrich tendon. So you sit there, dutifully chewing on your piece of gelatinous bare paw, trying to project an air of worldly sophistication. You are participating in a piece of elaborate theatre. The dish isn't food in the nutritional sense. It's a prop. Its purpose is to reinforce the social hierarchy. It separates the people at this table from everyone else. While the commoners outside are boiling weeds and insects in their congee pot just to survive, the nobles inside are dining on painstakingly prepared cartilage, not for survival, not for flavor, but for the sheer, glorious wastefulness of it all. This obsession with rare and exotic ingredients extended to all food groups, even to something as seemingly simple as the sweetness that might finish a meal. After the parade of salty, sour, bitter, and texturally challenging dishes, your modern palate craves something simple and sweet. A dessert. You imagine a delicate pastry, a sweet pudding, or perhaps a piece of candied fruit. The glamorous illusion of an imperial banquet suggests a grand finale of exquisite confectionery. Perhaps you've read poems that mention ice cream, sugar palaces, or honeyed delights, and your mind fills with images of fantastical sweets, crafted with the same artistry as the savory dishes. You picture a chef, a master of sugar work, spinning delicate threads of caramel or molding sweet bean paste into intricate floral shapes. You anticipate a wave of pure, crystalline sweetness to cleanse your palate and end the meal on a high note. A servant approaches and places a small, beautiful porcelain bowl in front of you. Inside are several glistening, amber-colored globes sitting in a light syrup. They look like perfectly preserved cherries or plums. Beside it is another small dish containing a single, pale, intricately carved square. It looks like a piece of firm jelly, or perhaps a type of fudge. Finally, a dessert to satisfy a simple craving. You reach for one of the amber globes, expecting a burst of familiar fruity sweetness. But as you bite into it, the taste is strange. It is sweet, yes, but not overpoweringly so. The sweetness is deep, dark, and complex, with an almost smoky or medicinal aftertaste. And the fruit itself is surprisingly firm and dates-like in texture. You try the pale, carved square. It's only mildly sweet, with a flavor you can't quite place, earthy, nutty, and a little bit starky. This is the shocking reality of the ancient world of sweets. There was no refined sugar. The crystalline white powder that forms the basis of virtually all modern desserts simply did not exist. The concept of pure sweetness was alien. Sugarcane existed, but the process of refining it into sucrose crystals was a technology that wouldn't become widespread for many centuries. So, when an ancient text mentions sugar, it's almost always referring to something else entirely. The world of sweetness was a subtle, complex, and often bizarre landscape of hard-won flavors derived from a handful of natural sources. The why is a matter of technology. Without the complex, multi-stage process of clarification, crystallization, and centrifugation, you simply cannot get pure sugar from a plant. Ancient chefs had to work with what nature gave them, and they became masters of extracting and concentrating these faint traces of sweetness. The most prized and luxurious sweetener was honey. But it was incredibly expensive and relatively rare. Apiaries existed, but wild honey was often sought after, a dangerous and labor-intensive prize. And the flavor of wild honey was not uniform. It varied dramatically depending on the flowers the bees visited, sometimes resulting in floral, medicinal, or even slightly bitter-tasting honey. The most common source of sweetness, the one you're likely tasting in that amber globe, was maltose. This is a sugar derived from grain, usually sprouted barley or wheat. The process was ingenious. Grain would be allowed to sprout, which activates enzymes that begin converting the grain's starches into sugars. The sprouted grain would then be dried, ground into a powder, and mixed with cooked rice or millet. This slurry would be kept warm, and the enzymes from the sprouted grain would go to work on the starches in this rice, breaking them down into simpler sugars. The liquid would then be strained and boiled down into a thick, dark, sticky syrup. This is malt syrup, or yihing. It's only about a third as sweet as refined sugar, and it carries with it the flavor of its parent grain, that earthy, slightly savory taste. It was the workhorse sweetener of the ancient kitchen, used to glaze meats, sweeten drinks, and make the simple confections you're now tasting. The amber globes are likely hawthorn berries or jujubes that have been laboriously boiled and coated in layers of this dark, sticky malt syrup, a process that also helped to preserve them. What about that pale, carved square? It could be a form of sweet made from pounded grains and nuts, bound together with a little of that malt syrup. Or it could be something even stranger. Some recipes called for concentrating the sweet juices of fruits like grapes or lychees by boiling them down into a thick paste. Others relied on the subtle, almost savory sweetness of ingredients like dried longans or cooked taro root. That starky sweet flavor you detected is a hallmark of these alternative desserts. And what of the fabled ice cream? The stories are true, in a way. The emperors did enjoy frozen treats, but they were a world away from the creamy, sugary dessert we know. Getting ice was a monumental undertaking. In the winter, large blocks would be cut from frozen rivers and lakes and then stored deep underground in insulated pits, packed with straw. It was an incredibly expensive and inefficient process. In the summer, a sliver of this precious, preserved ice would be shaved and then flavoured. But flavoured with what? Not sugar and cream. It would be mixed with fruit purees, a drizzle of that malt syrup, or perhaps even savoury ingredients. One frozen dish from the Tang dynasty involved a sort of custard made from flour, milk often from a water buffalo or goat, and camphor for its aromatic, medicinal scent, which was then cooled, but likely not frozen solid. It was more of a chilled, perfumed pudding. You are tasting the ghost of sweetness. It's a subtle, complex, and acquired taste. The ancient palate wasn't conditioned to expect the intense, one-dimensional sugar rush that ours is. Sweetness was a nuance, a hint, often blended with other flavors. A dish could be sweet and sour, or salty and sweet. The idea of a purely sweet course at the end of a meal was not as ingrained. As you finish the last of the earthy, malt-sweetened fruit, you realize that even the most fundamental flavors we take for granted have a history, and the most fundamental ingredient of all, the grain that formed the base of that malt syrup and the gruel in the commoner's pot, also has a forgotten past. We think of China and we think of rice, but for a huge part of its history, that was not the case at all. Your gaze falls upon a simple, unassuming bowl that has sat at the edge of your low table throughout the banquet. While other dishes have come and gone, this one has remained, a quiet constant. It's a small mound of steamed grain. For your modern eye, it registers instantly as rice. It's the default accompaniment, the neutral canvas upon which the stronger flavors of the other dishes are painted. The glamorous illusion is that of a timeless, unchanging China, a civilization built on the image of verdant, terraced paddies and peasants in conical hats tending to flooded fields. We see rice as being so intrinsic to Chinese culture that it feels as if it must have been there from the very beginning, the eternal foundation of every meal from the peasant's hut to the emperor's palace. The phrase, "Have you eaten yet?" in many Chinese dialects is literally, "Have you eaten rice?" It seems elemental, permanent. But as you look closer at the grain in the bowl, you notice it's not the fluffy, long-grained jasmine or the pearly, short-grained sushi rice you're familiar with. The grains are smaller, rounder, and have a distinct yellowish hue. You take a mouthful. The texture is not soft and pillowy. It's firm, almost gritty, with a noticeable toothsomeness that requires real chewing. The flavor is not neutral and slightly sweet, but nutty, earthy, and a little bit plain. It tastes ancient. Because it is. You are not eating rice. You are eating millet. And in this small, humble bowl lies the shocking reality that for thousands of years, across the vast heartland of northern China where its civilization was born and its great capitals were built, rice was a foreign luxury. The staff of life was this humble, hardy, and, by modern standards, rather unrefined grain. The why behind this is a simple matter of geography and climate. Rice is a thirsty, subtropical plant. It needs a long, warm, wet-growing season, which is why it flourished in the monsoon-drenched lands of the south. But the cradle of Chinese civilization is the Yellow River Valley in the north. This is a land of cold, dry winters and hot, short summers. It's a landscape that is fundamentally unsuited for cultivating rice paddies. But it is perfectly suited for millet. Millet is a survivor. It's a drought-resistant, fast-growing cereal grass that can thrive in poor soil and with little water. It was one of the first plants ever to be domesticated by humans in the region, long before rice cultivation became widespread. For dynasties upon dynasties, the Shang, the Zhao, the Qin, the Han, the entire food system was built on this grain. It was the currency of the state, collected as taxes and distributed as rations to soldiers and officials. The kundi pot we imagined for the commoner? It was almost certainly a millet kungi. The process of preparing it was also far more laborious than our modern, automated methods. The harvested millet had to be threshed to separate the grains from the stalks, and then painstakingly dehulled. This was often done by hand with a mortar and pestle, a back-breaking daily chore, and the process was imperfect. It was nearly impossible to remove every single bit of the tough outer husk and the occasional piece of grit, which is why the final product had that characteristic rough, sandy texture. What you are eating at this imperial banquet is the absolute finest quality, most meticulously cleaned and prepared millet available in the empire. It's the tribute grain, selected for its large, uniform kernels and painstakingly sifted to remove impurities. It is to common millet what a prime rib is to a cheap cut of stew meat. And yet, even at its absolute best, it cannot escape its fundamental nature. It is still a coarse, humble grain. The nobles around you eat it with a quiet respect. For them, It is not a boring side dish, it is the symbolic foundation of their world. It is the food that fed their ancestors, the grain that fueled the armies that built the empire. Rice, in this northern-centric world, was an exotic import from the wild, semi-civilized south. It was a status symbol, much like the strange meats we discussed earlier. A host might serve a small amount of polished white rice to show off their wealth and connections, a bit like serving champagne or caviar today. Its softness, its pristine white color, and its delicate, sweet flavor were prized precisely because they were so different from the daily reality of gritty, yellow millet. It would take centuries, marked by major shifts in population, the development of grand canals to transport grain from south to north, and the slow creep of political and cultural power southward, for rice to eventually usurp millet's throne and become the ubiquitous staple we now associate with all of China. Thinking about this bowl of millet changes your entire perception of the meal. It grounds the exotic flavors in a deep, earthy reality. The intensely salty preserved meats and the sour pickled vegetables suddenly make more sense. Their powerful flavors would be a welcome relief against the monotonous backdrop of a lifetime of eating plain, steamed millet. They were not just accompaniments, they were essential components needed to make the staple grain palatable. You take another bite of the ancient grain, feeling the rough texture on your tongue, and you realize that what you put in your bowl is just as important as what you put in your cup. And the drinks on this table, much like the food, hold their own forgotten history. Having considered the solid foods, your attention now turns to the liquids. In front of you sits that beautiful cup you noticed when you first arrived. It's made of pale green jade, cool and smooth to the touch, and it has been kept continuously full by a silent, attentive servant. Throughout the banquet, you've been taking sips of its contents, a warm, cloudy, semi-opaque liquid with a yellowish-white tint. The glamorous illusion, fueled by centuries of poetry and art, is that you are drinking a refined and potent wine, the poet's rite of jade nectar, of drinking parties that lasted for days, of officials and scholars finding inspiration or drowning their sorrows in their cups. We imagine something akin to a fine French wine, or a crystal-clear Japanese sake, a sophisticated beverage for a sophisticated culture. The very act of drinking from a jade cup implies a liquid of immense value and purity. You take a deeper, more analytical taste. It's not wine as you know it. There's no trace of grapes. That kind of viticulture was rare and largely a foreign novelty. The dominant flavor is that of grain, the same nutty, earthy taste you found in the millet, but transformed. It's slightly sweet, but also slightly sour, with a tangy, yeasty funk that reminds you a little of sourdough starter or even Belgian beer. It's served warm, not because that's an aesthetic choice, but because warming it helps to mellow its harsh notes and release its subtle aromas. And it is very, very weak. You've had several cups, yet you feel no more than a gentle, pleasant warmth spreading through your limbs. This is not a potent spirit. The shocking reality is that the ubiquitous alcoholic beverage of ancient China was not a clear, strong wine, but a murky, unfiltered, low-alcohol, fermented grain beverage that was likely consumed in vast quantities. It was, for all intents and purposes, a form of semi-liquid bread. This was jai, a word now translated as wine or liquor, but which originally referred to this much humbler, cloudier ancestor. The why behind its nature lies entirely in the technology of its production. Making a clear, stable, high-alcohol beverage is difficult. It requires specific yeast strains, temperature control, and, most importantly, the process of distillation, which wouldn't be practiced in China for another 1,000 years or more. The ancient method for making ghee was rustic and beautifully simple. It starts, as everything seems to, with grain millet, rice, or wheat. The grain is steamed and then spread out to cool. Then comes the magic ingredient, the starter, known as ghee. This wasn't a packet of scientifically isolated yeast. It was a cake made of raw flour and water, which was then taken to that same kind of special, humid room we encountered when learning about Jing. It was left out to be colonized by the wild yeasts and molds floating in the air. The result was a hard, dry brick teeming with a complex ecosystem of microorganisms. This cake would be crushed into a powder and mixed with the steamed grains and water in a large earthenware jar. The jar would be sealed and left to ferment. The wild molds in the would go to work first, breaking down the starches in the grain into fermentable sugars, a process called saccharification. Then, the wild yeasts from the would kick in, consuming those sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. Because it relied on wild microbes, the results were inconsistent. Some batches might be sweeter, others more sour. and because the yeasts were not particularly efficient, the final alcohol content was very low, probably somewhere between 2 and 5, about the same as a modern light beer. After a few weeks or months of fermentation, the jade was ready. But it wasn't filtered or aged in barrels. The contents of the jar were a soupy, porridge-like mixture of liquid and spent grain solids. To serve it, the raw liquid was simply ladled out. This is why it's cloudy, it's full of suspended grain particles and yeast cells. And because it wasn't pasteurized, it was still biologically active. It had a short shelf life and would continue to sour over time, hence the slightly tangy taste. This unfiltered beverage, known as unstrained or cloudy jade, was the most common form consumed by everyone from the farmer to the emperor. Of course, at an imperial banquet like this, you would be served a more refined version. The raw jade would have been carefully decanted, or perhaps passed through a coarse cloth sieve to remove the worst of the solids. This strained jade was clearer, more valuable, and more prestigious. The very act of straining it was a mark of luxury. The leftover solids, these alcoholic fermented grain dregs known as zo, were not thrown away. Remember, nothing is wasted. They were a valuable commodity in their own right, used as a preservative for meat and fish, or added to dishes to impart a winey, fragrant flavor. This beverage was more than just an intoxicant. It was a food source. It was packed with B vitamins from the yeast and carbohydrates from the grain. The laborers and soldiers, drinking copious amounts of this weak, soupy jade was a way to consume calories and stay hydrated. For the scholars and officials at your banquet, drinking it was a social ritual. Because it was so weak, they could drink it for hours on end during their famous parties, composing poetry and debating philosophy without becoming completely incapacitated. The goal wasn't to get drunk quickly, but to maintain a sustained, pleasant buzz over a long period. Drinking this warm, murky, slightly sour grain ale, you're tasting a beverage that is simultaneously a food, a social lubricant, and a ritualistic offering. It is the liquid soul of the millet-based world, a product born from the same rustic, microbial magic as the sauces and ferments, all created in a kitchen that was a far cry from the serene, orderly place you might imagine. As you continue to absorb the unfamiliar sensations of the banquet, the burn of salt, the cloudiness of the grain ale, the lingering medicinal bitterness, you begin to wonder about the place where all this strange magic happens, the kitchen. The glamorous illusion of the imperial kitchen is one of majestic, serene order. You imagine a vast, high-ceilinged chamber, perhaps with clean whitewashed walls and rows of gleaming bronze pots. You picture chefs in immaculate robes moving with silent, balletic grace, each a specialist in their own art, for carving, one for roasting, one for sauces. It's a vision of discipline and cleanliness, a culinary laboratory, where the emperor's alchemists turn base ingredients into golden feasts. It's the upstairs of Downton Abbey, but on an imperial scale, calm, professional, and almost sterile. Now, let's peel back that illusion and step through the swinging doors into the shocking reality. You would not find serene order. You would find a scene of controlled, smoky, chaotic, and frankly, hazardous industry. The ancient Chinese kitchen, even the imperial one, was not a pristine laboratory. It was a dark, greasy, and perpetually frantic workshop. The first thing that would hit you is the smoke. It would be everywhere, thick and acrid, stinging your eyes and catching in the back of your throat. There were no modern ventilation hoods, no chimneys as we know them. The cooking was done over open fires or on large, enclosed earthen stoves, but the smoke from the burning wood, charcoal, and coal simply billowed up to the ceiling, staining it black with soot, and then slowly, inefficiently, found its way out through a small hole in the roof or high on a wall. The air would be a thick soup of smoke, steam, and the atomized grease from a dozen sizzling wokes. The second thing you'd notice is the noise. The gentle music of the banquet hall would be replaced by a deafening cacophony. The percussive, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of heavy cleavers chopping through vegetables and bone on massive wooden blocks would be the dominant sound. Add to that the sizzle and pop of hot oil, the bubbling of great cauldrons of soup and congee, the shouting of orders, the clatter of pottery, and the grinding of ingredients in stone mortars. It would be loud, hot, and overwhelming. And the tools. Forget stainless steel and non-stick pans. The why of the kitchen's nature is rooted in its fundamental technology. The two undisputed kings of this domain were the cauldron and the cleaver. The cauldron, a large, heavy pot made of bronze or cast iron, was the center of the kitchen. It was used for everything: boiling grains, making soups, stewing tough meats for hours, rendering fat. It was a massive, inefficient piece of equipment that, once heated, stayed hot for a long time. Temperature control was rudimentary at best, involving adding more wood to the fire or pulling the pot away from the flames. The other essential tool was the cleaver. There wasn't a vast array of specialized knives like in a modern kitchen. The skilled Chinese chef used a single, heavy, rectangular cleaver for virtually every task. With it, they could slice meat paper thin, smash garlic, finely mince ginger, chop through chicken bones, and even delicately carve vegetables. The skill wasn't in the variety of the tools, but in the mastery of the one. Cleanliness would not be up to modern standards. The floor would be a treacherous slick of spilled water, oil, and discarded vegetable matter. The butcher's blocks, made of enormous cross-sections of tree trunks, would be permanently stained and scarred, the deep cuts harbouring generations of bacteria which, in a world without germ theory, was of no concern. Water had to be hauled in buckets from a well, making it a precious commodity not to be wasted on frivolous things like constant hand-washing. The focus was on a different kind of cleanliness, ensuring no sand or grit got into the master's food and that pests were kept at bay, a constant, losing battle. You might see small, terrier-like dogs, the ancestors of modern Shihtsus, whose official job was to patrol the kitchen and catch rats. This environment shaped the cuisine itself. The technique of stir-frying, which seems so quintessentially Chinese, was born from these conditions. A thin, cast iron wok could be heated to a ferocious temperature over the stove's fire pit. By chopping ingredients into small, uniform pieces, a chef could cook an entire dish in a matter of minutes. This was incredibly fuel-efficient. Instead of keeping a massive cauldron hot for hours to cook a large piece of meat, you could use a small amount of fuel to cook a meal very quickly. The stir-fry was a brilliant adaptation to the constraints of fuel scarcity and basic stove technology. The hierarchy of the kitchen was rigid and brutal. At the top was the master chef, an artist and a tyrant. Beneath him were ranks of under-chefs and apprentices who performed the endless, back-breaking labor, hauling water and fuel, gutting fish, plucking poultry and spending hours grinding spices or chopping vegetables into perfectly uniform matchsticks with their heavy cleavers. It was a hot, dangerous, and thankless job. Burns, cuts, and smoke-filled lungs were a daily reality. This chaotic, soot-stained workshop is the hidden engine powering the elegant, effortless performance you are witnessing in the banquet hall. Every delicate bite you take is the end result of a process that was anything but. And just as this kitchen had to adapt to its own technological limitations, it would soon have to adapt to a host of strange, new ingredients arriving from a world away. You are now well acquainted with the core components of this ancient meal: the preserved meats, the medicinal flavors, the gritty millet, and the cloudy grain ale. It's a complete, self-contained culinary universe built from the ingredients and technologies of this land. But as you survey the table, you notice a few small, jarring details, and in a dish of braised meat, you detect a subtle, aromatic warmth that is different from the pungent spices you've tasted so far. It's a woody, almost sweet fragrance. These seem like small, insignificant details. The glamorous illusion of a sophisticated cuisine is that it has always known how to use its ingredients, that recipes are perfected and timeless. We imagine a chef tasting a new spice from a faraway land and instantly understanding its properties, seamlessly integrating it into a classic dish. It's a fantasy of effortless culinary fusion. But the arrival of new ingredients from the Silk Road and maritime trade routes was not a smooth, graceful process. The shocking reality was a long and often clumsy period of culinary experimentation, confusion, and misunderstanding. When a new plant or spice arrived in the capital, often after a journey of thousands of miles, it didn't come with an instruction manual. The cook in Chang'an had no idea how a Persian farmer traditionally used a certain herb, or how a cook in India deployed a particular spice. They had to figure it out from scratch, and their first attempts were often very, very strange. Let's look at that cucumber. Cucumbers, originally from India, arrived in China via the Silk Road. Today, we think of them as a crisp, refreshing salad vegetable, best eaten raw. But in the context of the ancient Chinese kitchen, the concept of eating a raw vegetable was highly suspect. Raw foods were considered cold in their medicinal nature and potentially unclean. So, what did they do with the first cucumbers they got? They cooked them. They would be peeled, deseeded, and then boiled or stewed for a long time, just like any other gourd or melon. You can imagine the result: a soft, mushy, watery, and almost completely flavorless pulp. It would take a very long time for the idea of eating cucumbers raw, perhaps with a simple dressing of vinegar or jing, to catch on. You are tasting the ghost of that initial confusion: a boiled cucumber. an ingredient used in a way that completely negates its most pleasing qualities. The why behind this clumsy adoption process is threefold. First, there was the aforementioned lack of cultural context. Second, every new ingredient had to be filtered through that complex system of medicinal food theory we discussed. A court physician would examine the new food, taste it, and then make a pronouncement on its nature. Was it hot or cold? What flavor profile did it have? What organ did it affect? This would dictate its use. For instance, coriander, which arrived from the Mediterranean, was often treated not as a fresh, leafy garnish, but as a warming and pungent medicinal herb to be used in stews for dispelling cold humours. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was simple analogy. The cook would look at a new ingredient and think, what familiar thing does this resemble? When peppercorns first arrived, they were incredibly rare and expensive. Chefs accustomed to the native Sichuan peppercorn which numbs the mouth might have been confused by this new spice that only provided pungent heat. They might have used it sparingly, unsure of its purpose. The fragrant aroma you detected in that braised meat might be cloves or cinnamon, spices that trickled in from Southeast Asia. At first, they were likely treated like native aromatic woods and used more as a perfume for the food than as an integrated flavor, sometimes being added in whole pieces that were not meant to be eaten but simply to scent the dish as it cooked. Consider the journey of sesame seeds. They came from Central Asia and were initially treated as a grain, sometimes being ground and boiled into a bitter, oily porridge. It took time to realize that their true magic was unlocked when they were toasted to release their nutty aroma, or pressed to produce a fantastically fragrant oil that would go on to become a cornerstone of the cuisine. But in the beginning, there was likely a lot of sesame gruel. The same is true for the fava bean, which was also boiled to a mush before its other uses were discovered. You are sitting at a banquet at a crossroads in time. You are tasting the established, ancient palate of northern China, but you are also tasting the very first, tentative fumbles with a new global pantry. These foreign ingredients were status symbols, much like the bear paw. To have cucumbers, even if you boiled them into oblivion, was to show that you had access to the exotic. To scent your meat with a rare stick of cinnamon from a distant island was a mark of supreme wealth. The dishes are not yet fusion cuisine, they are traditional dishes with strange, experimental additions. It's like a medieval European chef getting his first tomato and trying to figure out what to do with it, probably by boiling it in a meat pie. It's the awkward, essential, and often unappetizing first draft of culinary history. This spirit of experimentation, however, wasn't just limited to new ingredients. It also applied to the textures of the food, leading to a deep cultural appreciation for sensations that a modern Western diner might find deeply challenging. Your culinary tour of the ancient banquet has challenged your palate with salt, bitterness, and unfamiliar grains. Now, it presents a new frontier, texture. You turn your attention to a dish you've been avoiding. It's a large bowl of shimmering, translucent soup, floating in the clear broth of various unidentifiable objects. Soft, gelatinous cubes that jiggle when you move the table, thin, slippery strands that look like noodles but aren't, and several pieces of meat that seem to be composed entirely of cartilage and skin. The glamorous illusion of Chinese food, particularly in the West, often focuses on the contrast of texturous crispness of a water chestnut, the tenderness of stir-fried beef. But this is a limited view. What you're looking at is a celebration of a whole other world of textures, one that is central to the historical palate, but often alien to a modern one. You imagine that these textures are perhaps an unfortunate byproduct of using cheaper cuts of meat. But as you watch the noble beside you, you see this is not the case. He specifically seeks out a piece of glistening, braised chicken skin with his chopsticks. He savors a particularly gelatinous piece of tendon. He slurps the slippery, soft strands with audible relish. The shocking reality is that these textures are not an accident. They are the entire point of the dish. The deep appreciation for what is called kan, or mouthfeel, is a cornerstone of Chinese gastronomy, and historically, the most prized textures were often the ones a modern Westerner might find the least appealing: the gelatinous, the cartilaginous, the slippery and the chewy. The why is complex, a mix of thrift, philosophy, and sensory appreciation. Let's start with thrift. As we've established, in a world of scarcity, nothing is wasted. This is especially true of an animal. A pig or a chicken was a huge investment of resources. To only eat the prime muscle meat and discard the rest would have been unthinkable. The skin, the feet, the ears, the tendons, the organs, all of it had to be consumed. But these parts are full of collagen and connective tissue. They are tough and inedible if cooked quickly. However, the ancient chefs discovered that with long, slow cooking hours of braising or simmering in a great cauldron, this tough collagen breaks down and transforms into gelatin. This process turns something inedible into a delicacy. The chicken feet become tender and gelatinous. The pork skin becomes soft and melts in your mouth. The tough tendon becomes a satisfyingly chewy morsel. They took a problem tough. Undesirable cut sand turned it into a culinary virtue. This practicality then evolved into a sophisticated aesthetic. The elite began to prize these textures for their own sake. They weren't just eating chicken feet because they were frugal. They were eating them because they genuinely loved the sensation of the soft skin and gelatin slipping off the tiny bones in their mouth. This created a demand for dishes that highlighted these textures. That bowl of soup in front of you might be a classic Buddha jumps over the wall, or one of its ancestors, a dish famous for containing a huge variety of ingredients, many of them chosen specifically for their textural contribution. The gelatinous cubes might be braised pork skin or sea cucumber. The slippery strands could be rehydrated fish more, the swim bladder of a large fish or a type of seaweed. The cartilaginous bits could be from a shark's fin or a duck's foot. The broth itself, rich and thick from all the dissolved gelatin, coats your lips and mouth, a sensation that is highly prized. This love of mouthfeel also ties into the medicinal food theory. Certain textures were believed to have health benefits. Gelatinous foods, coming from skin and cartilage, were thought to be good for one's own skin and joints. It's a form of sympathetic magicite, collagen, to replenish your own collagen. Slippery foods were thought to lubricate the body's internal pathways and aid in smooth digestion. This gave a medical justification for what was already a culinary preference. So you tentatively take a spoonful of the shimmering soup. The broth is deeply savory, but the experience is dominated by what happens in your mouth. The slippery fish more glides down your throat. The gelatinous cube of pork skin dissolves with a rich, fatty smoothness. You chew on a piece of tendon, which is not tough, but resilient and springy. It's a completely different way of eating, one that prioritizes physical sensation over simple flavor. It is, perhaps, the most difficult aspect of this ancient cuisine for an outsider to appreciate, because it requires unlearning a lifetime of textural prejudices. We are taught that slimy and rubbery are bad. Here, they are virtues. This appreciation for texture also explains the appeal of things we've already encountered. The strange status meats like bear paw or camel hump were prized as much for their unique gelatinous or fatty textures as for their rarity. Even in the plant world, ingredients like wood ear mushrooms are used not for their taste, they are very little, but for their delightful, crunchy yet chewy texture. Bamboo shoots are loved for their crisp bite. The entire culinary philosophy is one that engages the whole mouth, not just the taste buds. It's a world of bounces, slips, crunches, and melts. As you ponder this strange new sensory landscape, your attention is drawn to another aspect of the banquet, one that is not even for you. On a separate, ornate table, an identical set of dishes has been laid out, but no one is eating from it. The food is for guests who are unseen, unheard, but very much present. Your eyes are drawn away from your own table to a separate, more ornate altar-like table set up at a place of honor in the Great Hall. It is laden with a spectacular array of food, a mirror image of the feast being served to you and the other living guests. There is a whole steamed fish, a platter of what looks like roasted fowl, bowls of millet, and cups filled with that same cloudy grain ale. Yet, no one approaches this table. No one eats. The dishes sit there in silent splendor, steam gently rising from them, as if waiting for guests who have yet to arrive. The glamorous illusion is one of devout, solemn remembrance. This is a banquet for the ancestors. It's a beautiful and poignant ritual, a display of filial piety and respect for the spirits who came before. You see it as a purely symbolic act, a way of showing that the family, both living and dead, are united on this important occasion. The food is an offering, a spiritual communion, and its purpose ends there. But then, as the banquet for the living guests begins to wind down, you notice something that shatters this solemn illusion. Servants approach the altar table. They do not clear it away to be discarded. Instead, they carefully take the platters of now cool food and begin to redistribute them to the lower-ranking officials, the junior members of the household, and even to the servants themselves. The shocking reality is that this sacred offering, this spiritual meal for the ghosts of the ancestors, was often recycled and consumed by the living. This wasn't seen as disrespectful. It was a practical and deeply meaningful act, but one that came with its own set of strange and slightly unsettling implications. The why is rooted in the ancient Chinese worldview about the relationship between the living and the dead. The ancestors were not distant, ethereal spirits. They were considered active, influential members of the family. They had to be fed, placated, and honored to ensure their goodwill. If they were happy, they would bless the family with good fortune, health, and prosperity. If they were neglected, their hungry ghosts could cause all sorts of trouble. So, offering them food was a critical duty. But the belief was that the ancestors did not consume the physical food itself. Instead, they partook in its essence, its chi, or vital energy. This spiritual nourishment was most potent when the food was fresh, hot, and aromatic when its chi was at its peak. So, the family would prepare the best possible dishes. They would arrange them beautifully and present them to the spirits, often with elaborate rituals involving incense, prayers, and bowing. The ancestors would then have their meal, absorbing the spiritual essence of the feast. After a respectable amount of time had passed once the food had cooled and its potent, steaming chi had dissipated, the physical substance that remained was now just food. And in a world where, as we know, nothing is wasted, throwing it away would be the highest form of folly. It was now considered spirit-blessed food. To consume it was to partake in the ancestors' blessings, to physically ingest their benevolence. It was a way of closing the circle, of sharing a meal with the spirits in the most literal sense. There was, however, a very practical and slightly grim downside to this. The food would have been sitting out at room temperature for hours, in a hot, humid climate. That's a recipe for bacterial growth. While the food was not spoiled in the sense of being rotten, it was certainly past its prime. The fish would be cold and a little slimy. The roasted duck, once crispy, would now have soft, flaccid skin. The millet would be stiff and congealed. The common term for these leftovers was which literally means happiness food or blessed food, but it carried the quiet understanding that you were eating something that was a bit old. For the high-ranking nobles at the main tables, eating these leftovers was out of the question. But for the lower echelons of society, receiving a portion of the master's blessed leftovers was a great honor. It was a tangible link to the power and prestige of the main family line and their potent ancestors. They would eat the slightly off, cold food with gratitude. This practice highlights the incredible social stratification of the time. The A-team gets the hot, fresh food. The B-team gets the cold, spiritually eaten leftovers. It also adds another layer to the flavors of the past. Imagine the taste of a piece of wind-dried duck, already intensely salty, that has then sat out for 3 hours, its fats congealing, its texture growing tough. It's a taste of reverence mixed with risk. This practice also sheds new light on the importance of those powerful preservation techniques. A dish that was heavily salted, pickled, or preserved in jing was much more likely to remain safe to eat after sitting on an altar for a few hours. The same harsh flavors that made the food last on a long journey also made it last through a long ceremony. The entire system was ingeniously, if unintentionally, geared towards this kind of ritual recycling. The beautiful presentation of the dishes on the ancestral altar wasn't just for show, it was part of the offering. And this brings us to another layer of illusion in the ancient culinary world: the beautiful, poetic names given to the dishes themselves, which often serve to mask a much more humble or shocking reality. Throughout this long and bewildering banquet, you've been grappling with the disconnect between what you see and what you taste. The artful presentation, the grand hall, the silken robes, it all creates an expectation of delicacy and refinement. And then, there are the names. When a dish arrives, the servant murmurs a poetic, evocative title. You've already heard Dragon's Embrace of the Phoenix's Wing for the platter of strange status meats. Another dish, a simple soup with greens, was called jade cabbage. A plate of pale, stir-fried morsels was introduced as hibiscus blossoms floating on a snowy river. The glamorous illusion is that this is high poetry, a sophisticated literary game that elevates the act of eating into an art form. It suggests that the food is as ethereal and beautiful as its name. You imagine the ingredients must be incredibly rare and pure to warrant such lofty descriptions. You decide to investigate. You discreetly ask the attendant what is in the jade cabbage soup. He explains that it's a simple soup made with bok choy and small, white tofu curds. The name comes from the visual. The green of the cabbage resembles jade, and the white tofu floats like precious ivory. It's a pretty metaphor for a humble dish. Then you ask about the hibiscus blossoms floating on a snowy river. The reality here is a little more surprising. The snowy river is a bed of scrambled egg whites, and the hibiscus blossoms. They are small, artfully arranged pieces of stir-fried pig's kidney. The beautiful name is a clever and deliberate act of misdirection. This is the shocking reality hidden behind the menu's poetry. The beautiful names were not just for artistic flair, they were often a form of sophisticated camouflage, designed to obscure humble origins, mask unappetizing ingredients, or simply to make a dish sound far more exciting than it actually was. The why behind this linguistic trickery is all about psychology and status. In a court environment obsessed with elegance, refinement, and face, you couldn't just serve a dish called pig's kidneys and eggs. It sounds crude, medical, and common. But hibiscus blossoms floating on a snowy river sounds like something a poet would eat. It transforms a mundane collection of ingredients into an experience. Let's decode a few more. A famous dish from later imperial times called ants climbing a tree sounds like something from a survivalist's handbook, but it's actually a beloved and simple dish of cellophane noodles, the tree branches coated in a sauce of seasoned ground pork. The ants. The name is a whimsical visual description of a very common meal. Another classic is husband and wife lung slices. The name is startling and frankly a bit gruesome, but it refers to a cold appetizer from situ made from thinly sliced beef and beef offal, such as heart, tongue, and trypino. Lung is typically used in the modern version, though it likely was in the past. The name comes from the story of a couple who invented and sold the dish on the streets. The poetic menu name elevates the food, distancing it from its bloody, visceral origins in the butcher's shop. This practice allowed chefs to be both incredibly frugal and incredibly creative. Remember the all-consuming cunny pot of the commoner? The imperial kitchen had its own version of using everything. Organ meats, or offal, were a key part of the cuisine, but to serve them to the emperor and his high-ranking officials, they needed a rebranding. So, stir-fried tripe might become peony blossoms, with the pieces of tripe carefully scored to resemble the petals of a flower. A soup made with coagulated pig's blood, a common and highly nutritious food, might be given a name like red clouds in a verdant sea if it also contained green vegetables. The poetry was also a way to show off the chef's skill. To take a humble ingredient like a turnip and, through masterful carving, turn it into a flock of tiny swans swimming in a clear broth, and then to name it 100 birds paying homage to the phoenix, was the ultimate display of culinary alchemy. The chef had not just transformed the turnip's physical form, but also its very identity. He had turned a root vegetable into a legend. This was particularly important for vegetarian dishes, which were often consumed for religious or health reasons. A dish made entirely of mushrooms, tofu and root vegetables could be given a grand name like dragon and phoenix to make it sound as prestigious as its meaty counterparts. The dragon might be a long, dark shiitake mushroom and the phoenix a carefully carved piece of fried tofu. As you look around the banquet table one last time, you see the entire meal in a new light. It's a complex web of illusions. The illusion of freshness masking the reality of preservation. The illusion of flavor masking the reality of medicine. The illusion of luxury masking the reality of bizarre status symbols. And the illusion of poetry masking the reality of humble or shocking ingredients. It's a cuisine built on beautiful lies. And yet, these lies were essential. They made survival taste like luxury, they made medicine taste like a feast, and they turned the act of eating into a grand performance of power and culture. And though this specific culinary world has vanished, faint echoes of its unique flavors, its forgotten ingredients, and its strange logic can still be found, hiding in plain sight in our modern world. The banquet is drawing to a close. The lamps are burning lower, casting long, dancing shadows across the great hall. The music has softened to a barely audible murmur. The servants glide silently, clearing the last of the lacquered bowls and jade cups. The intense, overwhelming flavors of the feast, the aggressive salt, the sharp sourness, the medicinal bitterness, the funky depth of fermentation have faded from your tongue, leaving behind a faint, ghostly memory. You feel as though you've woken from a strange and vivid dream. It's easy to believe that this entire culinary world has vanished without a trace, a lost chapter in the history of taste, completely replaced by the flavors we know today. The glamorous illusion is one of complete culinary revolution. We imagine that the arrival of new ingredients and new technologies created a clean break with the past. The introduction of the fiery chili pepper, the widespread availability of refined sugar, the dominance of rice and modern cooking techniques must have surely wiped the slate clean, erasing these ancient, challenging flavors from the earth. We see modern Chinese cuisine in all its incredible regional diversity as a new creation born in a more recent, more abundant era. It feels disconnected from the gritty, preserved and medicinally balanced world of the banquet you just attended. But the shocking reality is that the ghosts of these forgotten flavors are all around us, hiding in plain sight. They are not the dominant notes anymore. but they persist as quiet echoes, faint whispers of the past in the corners of our modern pantry and on the menus of regional specialists. The ancient palate has not been erased, it has been submerged, leaving behind subtle but distinct traces for those who know where to look and what to taste. This banquet, this journey into the deep past, has given you the ability to recognize them. The why of this persistence is the incredible conservatism of food culture. While cuisines evolve, they rarely throw anything away completely. Core techniques and foundational flavor profiles have a way of lingering for centuries, even millennia, adapting themselves to new ingredients and new contexts. That all-important, life-giving fermented sauce, the jing. Its direct descendants are the soul of many Asian cuisines today. Soy sauce is, in essence, the liquid strained from a soybean jing fermentation. Miso paste from Japan is a direct continuation of this ancient tradition. The thick, savory bean pastes used in Korean and Chinese cooking, like doenjang and huangdujiang, are modern cousins of the very same stuff you saw the nobles reverently adding to their food. When you taste the deep umami of these sauces, you are tasting the legacy of that moldy brick and sun-baked pot. What about the obsession with preservation? While refrigeration has made it less of a daily necessity, the flavors born from that necessity have become beloved for their own sake. That wind-dried, salt-cured duck, the larue, is still made and cherished today, especially in regions like Sichuan and Hunan. It's no longer just a survival food. It's a delicacy, prized for its intense, concentrated flavor and satisfyingly chewy texture. It's sliced thin and stir-fried with vegetables or steamed and eaten with rice, a nostalgic taste of a time before refrigeration. The same is true for all manner of pickled vegetables, salted fish and preserved greens, which remain vital components of many regional cuisines, providing a pungent, appetizing counterpoint to the richness of meat or the blandness of rice. Even the focus on medicinal balance lingers. The foundational ideas of hot and cold foods still inform daily life for millions. The Chinese mother might tell her child not to eat too much fried chicken or hot food for fear of getting a sore throat. She might brew a cooling herbal tea in the summer to ward off the heat. This ancient philosophy is still alive in the way meals are constructed and in the folk wisdom passed down through generations, and the deep love for strange textures. It's one of the defining characteristics that still distinguishes many East Asian cuisines. A dim sum restaurant is a veritable museum of ancient textures, the chewiness of steamed rice noodles, the gelatinous tenderness of braised chicken feet feng zao, the slippery smoothness of tripe, the appreciation for sea cucumber, fish maw, and all things cartilaginous is still a mark of a sophisticated traditional palate. These are not new inventions, they are living relics of that ancient preference for mouthfeel. The coarse grains, like the millet you tasted, are even making a comeback. In a modern health-conscious world, these ancient grains are being rediscovered for their nutritional benefits and their earthy, complex flavors. You can now find millet porridge on trendy breakfast menus, a dish that connects the modern diner directly back to the humble congee pot that sustained China for millennia. Even the murky, unfiltered grain ale has modern descendants in the form of regional, homemade, often sweet and cloudy rice wines like Jining or Korean made jolly. As you step out of the great hall and into the cool night air, the feast no longer seems so alien. You realize that you haven't just been a tourist in a lost world. You have been learning the grammar of a deep culinary language that is still being spoken today, albeit in a different dialect. The flavors are not forgotten, merely transformed, waiting to be recognized. The air outside is calm and quiet now, a gentle reprieve from the sensory intensity of the banquet. The moon hangs high and bright, casting a silver light on the curved eaves of the palace roof. The sounds of the city are muffled and distant, a low and steady hum that is as peaceful as a lullaby. The memory of the strange and powerful flavors begins to recede, leaving not a shock to the senses, but a deep and resonant understanding of a world so different, yet so fundamentally connected to our own. You can feel the day's excitement and the richness of the feast settling within you. A pleasant weight that encourages your body and your mind to finally slow down, to let go of the sharp details and drift into a softer, more tranquil state of awareness. The journey is over, and now it is time for rest. The stories have been told, the secrets have been shared, and the ghosts of the past have been fed. They can now retreat back into the quiet shadows of history, leaving you in the peaceful stillness of the present moment. Allow your thoughts to drift as gently as the last wisp of incense smoke, carrying with it the faint, lingering perfume of sandalwood and ancient spices, a fragrance that now seems less like a challenge and more like a soft, familiar whisper from a time long, long ago. End of script. Sweet dreams.